As you may already know, my name's Clare Baker and I'm a former clutterholic and borderline hoarder. I successfully cleared all my clutter in 11 areas and rooms of my home over 20 years ago without the need for an expensive home visit. And I've been helping people around the world do exactly the same ever since, so that they too can know what it's like to live a completely clutter-free life forever. I like to share my experiences both before and after I cleared my clutter to help fellow clutterholics and hoarders and their friends and family to understand some of the thoughts, feelings, and experiences that we have when we struggle with clutter. What I share is not intended to be a judgment or criticism of anyone that I mention, although I fully understand that some people may take it that way. There are at least three perspectives on the same experience: yours, mine, and the facts of the experience that probably lay somewhere in between. I share my perspective on my experiences, which is a reflection from which I can share my learning with others who may have similar experiences. As you may already know, a key ingredient of my clutter challenge was my relationship with my parents. Both my parents have insecure attachment issues because of their families and their life experiences. My brother and I inherited it from them too. And for both of us, it was then accentuated by our own life experiences. So it's no surprise that my brother and I both struggled with clutter, which is strongly linked to insecure attachment. In fact, over the last 10 years, I've come to accept that one of the key reasons why I'm estranged from my parents is because of our insecure attachment issues and my desire to have healthy, secure attachments. When you have insecure attachment, you find it difficult to connect to others. You try to avoid commitment and intimacy, both physical, mental, and emotional. You become clingy in relationships. You struggle to make friends, and you struggle to accept criticism. You avoid showing your emotions, usually because you struggle to identify your emotions and you don't have the skills to manage them. Indeed, when you're insecurely attached, when you feel vulnerable, you can often appear selfish and/or controlling. I first became aware that there are different attachment styles, and particularly my inherited insecure attachment, when I did my life timeline exercise at the start of my clutter clearing journey. I could clearly see the pattern of going from one extreme to the other in my relationships, whether that was with my parents, brother, friends, or partners. It was all or nothing for me. I realized that because of my fear of rejection, I also had a habit of staying in relationships, even though I didn't fully trust the other person. I learned through therapy that I was mirroring the unhealthy, insecure relationship that I had with my mother. My life timeline exercise enabled me to see how I never developed a strong, emotionally secure foundation of unconditional love, especially with my mother, due to her inherited insecure attachment that she had with her own mother and events and experiences in her life. I could see how my attachment to my mother had become even more insecure because of multiple examples of her lack of emotion, compassion, and unconditional love towards me when certain negative events and experiences happened in my own life. For example, when I was 13, I told my mother that I had been interfered with by a male babysitter when I was 6. Without showing any emotion, my mother told me that it didn't matter because it happened a long time ago. She then got out of the car we were in at the time and walked away. I felt abandoned. On my return from my trip to South America when I was in my 20s, the vicar's wife told me that when I was in hospital with food poisoning and malaria, when my mother had arrived at church that Sunday, it was clear she had been crying. When church friend members tried to comfort her, she was so scared of appearing emotionally vulnerable that she told them she hadn't been crying, she just had something in her eye. The vicar's wife told me they didn't believe her. Later in life, after I had been at university for just a couple of weeks, I told my parents I wanted to leave. My parents' response was to stop the conversation when I started talking about how I was feeling. Instead, they sent me to see a therapist. When I broke off my engagement to a man from West Africa and told my mother with tears rolling down my face, she didn't hug or comfort me. She asked me what I wanted her to tell people, then left the room. When my relationship with them started to deteriorate, a family friend told them to go and sit on my doorstep and insist on talking to me to resolve it. Their response was, "We don't do things like that." I wasn't surprised. Their insecure attachment doesn't allow them to be vulnerable or uncomfortable. Years later, I told my mother that my husband and I couldn't have children. She responded not with hugs and comfort, but by saying that I was lucky because she believed she would have been happier if she hadn't had children. It wasn't anything I hadn't heard before. Yes, there was plenty of evidence of being an insecurely attached, unloved daughter in my life timeline that I had chosen to ignore or justify in my past. There was also evidence that I had a mother who avoided and dismissed her own feelings and avoided vulnerability at all costs. Therapy came to provide me with an emotional support that I needed and that my mother wasn't capable of providing. The emotional void in my life was huge, and it wasn't just evident with my parents. Looking at my life timeline, I noticed that all my friendships and relationships were very short-lived, which I had always justified by saying that when I realized that I was making more effort than them, I wouldn't waste any more time. In truth, that was my excuse for avoiding emotional intimacy and vulnerability because I didn't know how to manage my emotions. It felt unsafe to be open and vulnerable with anyone, and I didn't want to risk getting emotionally hurt like I had in the past with my mother. I knew I didn't have the unconditional emotional support that I needed at home. I would only get practical and financial support from my parents. I also realized how I had often misinterpreted other people's kindness and interest in me. I could never tell whether a man liked me, and I assumed that if he wanted to see me more than once, he must be interested in me romantically. Then when I started seeing them regularly, I became clingy and needy. My people-pleasing never seemed to make a difference to how people treated me, and only made me vulnerable to frequently being taken advantage of financially, emotionally, and practically. As my therapist Meg pointed out, I was choosing people who mirrored the insecure relationship that I had with my parents, especially my mother, because that was part of my comfort zone. Oh yes, there was hard evidence in my life timeline. I had either chosen to ignore it in the past or assumed that what I had experienced was normal and what everyone experienced. This new awareness gave me a choice: continue the pattern or start getting uncomfortable and build some new, secure relationships into my life. Although I became aware of my insecure attachment when I cleared my clutter over 20 years ago, it would take much longer to change my habits of thinking and doing to reach a point where I felt that I had achieved safe, secure attachment in my relationships, especially my marriage. Unsurprisingly, I married a man who also had insecure attachment issues. That's why we get on so well and why we decided to work on it together. After my estrangement from my parents, I subconsciously transferred my insecure attachment to my mother-in-law. I was desperate for her approval, which she would give me in waves. It would take years for me to finally break the habit of seeking her approval. When I finally did, it was met with anger and hostility because we were no longer mutual enablers. My husband and I have worked hard on building secure attachment with each other and those around us. When we met, we were both people pleasers, a classic sign of insecure attachment. We both struggled with our self-esteem, and we both struggled with healthy boundaries with family and friends. With the help of therapy early on in our marriage, we're now able to openly and honestly share our feelings and emotions with each other without fear of being vulnerable, without fear of being dismissed or judged, something neither of us experienced in childhood. Insecure attachment, whether it's inherited, triggered in childhood, or triggered and intensified by trauma and events throughout our lives, can sabotage more than just our homes and our clutter. It can sabotage our ability to live our best life. If you can acknowledge and accept that you have insecure attachment, you can turn things around and start to build secure attachments into your relationships. I know from my own experience, this will enrich your relationships, your life, and make your best life even more incredible than you ever imagined it could be. You can clear your clutter fast, or you can clear your clutter forever, but you can't clear your clutter forever fast. To find out how I can help you clear your clutter forever without the need for an expensive home visit, click on the link with this video now.